Hello everyone, today I'm doing things a little different. Today's the 1 year anniversary of me posting my first story, which I did on this day last year because it was Friday the 13th and I just needed to rip the band-aid. I'm going to be telling a remastered version of that first story today because I feel I've grown in my storytelling abilities over the last year. I'm going to do a little how things got started and then we'll get into the story. This channel will also be getting renamed. I recently learned that someone else has a channel with a similar name, so go ahead and comment with any ideas for that, and my amazing artist at Pain Therapy is going to be designing a new logo for me with the name. If you comment and contribute to the renaming in any way, you'll be entered into a drawing to receive 20% off of a design for yourself. So, how this all got started. I was going through a rough patch in life. I was recently divorced and moved to get a great job that turned into a shit show. Not the job, just the entire situation. This ultimately led me to being homeless and forced to go back to my hometown. Though now looking back, I can say that I'm grateful for this as it gave me a 1.5 years to spend with my mom before her unexpected passing last year. My mom and my daughter are my biggest encouragers to start this channel and have always been my biggest supporters. While in my hometown, though, I started thinking of all the murders that happened there and how it's such a small town and no one really knows about them. It's definitely not one of those cool small towns where nothing ever happens. It has a population of less than 10,000 people and they average 1 to 2 murders a year. And that's just what they'll classify as murder. There's a lot of corruption and lazy investigation that occurs, so many things get swept under the rug. My daughter knows I love true crime and got me hooked on mrballen. We would listen to his stories all day long, and I came up with the idea to submit this story to him. He was great and he responded to me, but every time I would try to write the story, I just ended up starting to tell it because it's personal and I couldn't really just summarize it. So I thought, why don't I just start a channel and cover the murders that happen here? I started researching and writing, but I could never bring myself to actually tell the stories and post them until 6 months after the idea came. I just kept researching and writing stories, and I would make excuses like I hate my voice, and then I thought about doing an AI character. Finally, I settled on doing a voiceover pictures and ripped the band-aid off today 1 year ago. So without any further delay, this is the revised version of Murder Where the Forest Meets the Sea. In October of 1994, a beautiful young woman with fiery red hair was making her way to California by hitchhiking. She wanted to travel and see the world, and her first stop was going to be the beach in Crescent City. She had plans to go to the beach, look at the stars, and fall asleep to the sound of the ocean waves. A couple of men had picked Camillia up in Brookings, Oregon, about 30 minutes north of Crescent City, and gave her a ride to California. Camillia called her aunt, who was more like a mother to her, to check in. Her aunt didn't answer, and Camillia left a message saying she was in Crescent City, California, she was okay, and would call again soon. One day after Camillia arriving in Crescent City, a call came in to dispatch. 2 men walking noticed some items about 20 to 30 feet down a ravine in Jedediah Smith State Park. The men said there were shoes, a scarf, and a green sleeping bag, and it looked like there was something in the bag. They also said that they had thrown rocks at the sleeping bag, and there seemed to be something inside. 3 days later, the Delnorte County Sheriff's Department went to investigate the items in the ravine that the men had called about. As the investigators looked around, they found a bag of belongings containing an ID and a journal. They also noticed bright red hair sticking out of the green sleeping bag. The body is a young female with rope around her neck. She's in the fetal position and tied up. She has cuts and bruises all over her body and face. Most of the flesh from her left arm is gone. She was dressed, and her belongings were scattered around her, including her backpack. In the backpack, they found an ID letting them know that the body inside of the sleeping bag is 18-year-old Camillia Randall. They also found her journal with an entry from 10/26 talking about 2 men that gave her a ride to Crescent City from Brookings. She mentioned their names in her journal entry, so investigators were able to quickly locate the men and question them. They both had verifiable alibis and were not found to be responsible for the tragic death of Camillia. After clearing the 2 men, who were seemingly the last people to see Camillia alive, the investigation was back at square one. The autopsy had taken place, and Camillia's body told a pretty horrific story of how she ended up in that sleeping bag 30 feet down a ravine in the redwood forest. But it didn't generate any leads as to who brutally taken her life. The medical examiner had confirmed she was repeatedly assaulted sexually and physically. The cuts on her face and body were made by a double-edged instrument, likely a knife, and none of her lacerations were caused by animals biting her. Now, this is truly tragic and horrific to hear, but it gets worse. Not only was she raped and tortured, the medical examiner found that almost her entire left breast was removed. There was a hole in her left side around her armpit area, and her heart and left lung had been removed. She had broken ribs, and the cause of death was strangulation. The markings on her neck indicated a belt was used, not the rope that was found around her neck. They came to the conclusion that the rope was just used to get her down into the ravine where her body was found. A rape kit was taken containing swabs of her vaginal and oral cavities where semen was visibly present, and upon testing the swabs collected, pathologists found that the samples collected from her mouth contained no saliva mixed in. This meant that she was already deceased at the time of oral copulation. These samples did generate a DNA profile, but it was 1994 and the DNA database known as CODIS didn't exist quite yet. And though it seemed they had a lot of information, it didn't get investigators any closer to finding out who was responsible, and like so many cases during this time, Camillia Randall's case went cold. Her case would stay cold for almost 7 years until her rape kit samples were loaded into CODIS 3 years after it was created, and this generated a match. A registered sex offender with his DNA now on file matched the samples found on Camillia's body. Robert Allen Wigly is the registered sex offender who left the DNA found in Camillia's rape kit. DNA has not always been the golden standard of crime solving, so at this point in time, investigators wanted more than just the DNA match. But now they had a name, and even after Wigly was identified as the individual who left the contributions on Camillia, when he was interrogated, he repeatedly denied any involvement and even knowing her. The investigator told Wigly, "Your DNA is on this girl." He was shown crime scene photos of Camillia's beaten and tortured lifeless body, and he just continued to deny knowing her. The investigators wanted to make sure that the person capable of doing these unspeakable acts to another human would never see the light of day again, so they continued to investigate. At this time, Wigly was already in jail facing other charges for multiple probation violations. This gave them a little more time to conduct their investigation while knowing he couldn't hurt anyone else in the meantime. They decided to start with Wigly's ex-wife, and at first she was too scared to say anything to them. She expressed her fears, and after countless reassurances and being told there was additional evidence that would assure he would never get out, she opened up to them. The story she had was just as horrific as what had been done to Camillia, except his ex-wife had been the brunt of his anger and sadism every day for years. She told investigators of the extreme physical abuse and the repeated sexual assault that she had endured. She had been hospitalized numerous times, always telling doctors the typical victim lines like, "I fell, I'm clumsy, I ran into a door," etc. He had frequently choked her to unconsciousness, held guns to her head, forced her to participate in sexual encounters with strangers he picked up from the bar, and even her own family members, and some of them were underage. Wigly was no stranger to law enforcement, though, and had multiple counts of sexual assault on minors and other women, including penetration with a foreign object on a girl under 14, assault complaints for causing bodily harm, sexual battery, and he took a plea deal for some of these crimes and was given a 4-year prison sentence, which was turned into 1 year time served and 5 years probation. Papers were filed to revoke probation for moving across state lines without permission multiple times, which is why Wigly was already in jail. And in November of 2001, Wigly was arrested for his involvement in the death of Camillia. In January of 2002, he had a hearing for the numerous probation violations, where his original 4-year term was reinstated plus an additional 4 years to run concurrent. He was given 537 days credit as he was already in custody, but this would allow them to keep Wigly incarcerated until his trial for Camillia's murder that occurred in 2003. After going through all of his infractions, it appears as though he's backtracking as a criminal. Generally, as repeat offenders commit crimes, they get better at it and more confident and will go further and further. This is an obvious progression. The individual may be excited by killing, but they might not be up for it the first time, or they have a lack of self-confidence for the follow-through. Maybe they're just experimenting to find out what really excites them in each encounter. Generally speaking, serial rapists and murderers do not start at torture, murder, and removing body parts and then just go back to assaulting their victims. Wigly did seem to like to brag and tell his story while he was incarcerated and told many cellmates that he did in fact have a partner, but he never said who. Over time, many versions of this story was told to multiple people. Some of these versions involved another man, some didn't, but his wife was always involved in every story that he told about this crime. For the upcoming murder trial, Wigly decided to fire his public defender and represent himself. This gave him access to all of the evidence as it came in, and since he never gave investigators a statement or confessed, he was able to tailor all future statements to debunk the evidence the investigators had before the trial. He decided to spin Camillia's murder as a threesome gone wrong that ended in his wife, at the time, killing Camillia. His ex-wife actually had hospital records that proved she was in the hospital the day before Camillia arrived in Crescent City, which was likely an accident at the hands of her husband, making it unlikely that she helped out with mutilation and murder unless she was forced to by him, like she had been forced to do so many things in the past. The jury agreed, and in November of 2003, Robert Allen Wigly was found guilty of the murder of Camillia Randall and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was said to be emotionless and show no remorse, even smirking at Camillia's family. He's never confessed, and her missing body parts were never recovered. In 2007, Wigly appealed this decision, stating that he had requested counsel during the trial and never received a lawyer after his request. His appeal was denied as the statute of limitations had expired. But during the trial, when he requested counsel, he actually received an attorney, and the attorney filed papers to dismiss themselves as his counsel due to his inability to cooperate with his own attorney. During the trial, Wigly had also petitioned to have the presiding judge removed from his case, but this motion was denied. To this day, he's never come forward with the name of his supposed partner, but has been known to make statements such as, "I shouldn't have left her body where it would be found." Now, remember in the beginning when I said this story was personal to me, and you probably don't, but now you're like, oh yeah, and you're wondering how? Robert Wigly and his wife at the time lived in a mobile home on his parents' property, and his parents lived next door to my mother. Yes, during the time he brutally tortured, raped, and killed Camillia, he lived next door to me, and I was almost 10 years old at the time, and my sister, who's just about 6 years older than me, would have been the perfect age for him. I also had a trampoline that I would jump on every day, maybe about 20 feet from their houses, and my friends and I always had this feeling like we were being watched, and I'm sure that we were. We actually wanted to camp out on my trampoline one night, and we were just so overwhelmed with this weird feeling and being super creeped out that we went inside, which may have ultimately saved our lives, or at least our innocence. I'm just glad, knowing what I know now, that he never set his sights on us and followed through. And that's going to do it for today. I hope you enjoyed hearing the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. If you haven't already and you did enjoy the story, like, love, and make sure to check out the previous stories I have posted. Also, if you enjoyed this story or any others I have, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a future installment. Feel free to share with anyone who enjoys less than well-known dark reality stories, and leave a comment or let me know if there are any stories that you would personally like me to research and cover. Have a great weekend.